KCAA Loma Linda, 1050 AM, K292FQ Riverside, and K293CF Moreno Valley.
Shelter for women and kids called Time for Change Foundation, where she helps them to rebuild their lives. Welcome, Lizzie.
Welcome, Lizzie.
Hi, Alyssa.
Hi.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you both so much for having me on your radio show. I'm so excited to be here with both of you. Thank you again for having me.
Yeah,
Thank
we're
you.
excited to have
Yes.
you. Yay.
Super excited.
Very.
Okay.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your story, Lizzie?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with, I'll start with my childhood. So for me, I would say now that I'm an adult, it was very dysfunctional. But at the time when I was a child, I mean, I felt like things were pretty okay. But there was a lot of key points that happened in my life, which I want to share because it leads up to when I got into my addiction. So growing up, my mom, she was a preschool teacher. My dad was a foreman for a union steel company. So financially, we had everything that we needed. My dad always provided. My mom was the good mom, is what my dad would call her, because anything that we wanted, we would get. And so because my dad worked so much, my mom was more of the forefront parent. And so I think what she was trying to do was do her best and didn't want to do what my grandmother did with her. And so she was encouraging towards us, but I would say she didn't really have rules for us. But our childhood was so fun because where we grew up, so my parents, I was born in Long Beach, but my parents ended up building their home in Fontana behind my grandparents' house. So it's a big property. And so they built this property behind my grandparents' house. So the only thing that separated from me and my grandparents' house was they built a laundry room hallway. And this is such a big part because my grandparents were always involved in our life. So back then, I didn't think anything of it, but my grandparents pretty much kind of picked up the slack in some areas. But it just seemed like, okay, we're just a big family. We're all here together. But next door, we had my grandfather's brother that was living there, and then his kids, which were adults, but then they had their kids. And then next door to that was another cousin's house. And then next door to that was
That's cool.
Friends of my mom when they grew up, from elementary to high school. So we all played together. Like we were those kids on the block till the lights came out. I mean, till the dark was out. Right? We're like out there just playing, having a good time. We did the whole, riding our bikes, played sports. We played hide and seek on the whole block. We would call radio stations to request songs. That's how old I am, We would do the whole lemonade and pizza stands, and it was just fun. But one thing that when I look back to my childhood, I just remember in my early preteen years, I started to feel alone. Yeah. And I started to feel a little more isolated. I would want to stay in. I didn't want to go play out as much. There was some friction going on in my home. My parents were starting to argue. My dad was the dad that would discipline us. So my dad was that dad that would whoop your butt in front of everybody. He did not care. Yeah. And that for me was very embarrassing because there was times where my dad would have the broom and just be whacking us in front of everybody, and people are scared, and he's yelling. And I'm like, at that age, I was embarrassed, and then I would have to go to school, and then you see your friends. And then my mom and dad had a lot of ups and downs. And I think for me, where things really shifted at a young age was when I was around 10. At the time, I didn't understand, but my mom had this new boyfriend. And my mom became very impulsive. And I'm not diagnosing her whatsoever, but she's openly shared with us, she's dealt with her mental health, and it was bipolar behaviors. Yeah. So she would have these really great days, and then there was days where we didn't even want to bring anybody home because we didn't know if she was gonna yell at them too, because she would just go off. And so I just felt that isolation where I didn't want to talk so much, and I would just stay in my room. My brother was a teenager at the time, so he would have had all his friends over, and to me they were annoying because they're boys, and and I didn't want to be around that, so I would just stay in my room. And I just remember feeling sad. I felt sad. And I was a daddy's girl. So when this happened with my mom, I know now what it was. She was having an affair. Yeah. And at the time, I didn't understand. I just thought, oh, my mom has this new boyfriend. She ended up kicking my dad out. My dad had to go move in with a brother in LA. And that was a big thing for me because I'm like, my dad's not in the house. Like my dad's my everything, right? He provided for us, but he was very loving, towards me and would defend me, from whatever my mom was doing sometimes, but he was a rule enforcer. So to me, I really liked that because my mom just let us do whatever we wanted.
Yeah. You needed some structure.
So when that happened, again, I was probably around 10 to 12. And it's like those like time lapses where I don't remember how long it was for, but I just remember, back then people's parents weren't divorced. Like that was like a big thing. Like your parents aren't together. What happened? And I just felt so much shame over that. Like if it was my fault, for some strange reason, but my brother, because he was a teen at the time, he would tell me, don't trust that guy. Like, he's just trying to buy us because he had this nice place by the beach and, he had money and this and that, and he would buy us things. And I'm like this little 10-year-old kid, like, oh, cool, I have this, I have that. He got us this. And he would tell me, don't let him buy us. He would tell me that. And fast forward to, like, just all the pain that we felt, because there was days where my dad would come and be banging on the door because he wanted to come in. And my mom would not let him see it. It was just crazy stuff. So one day my mom, for her, this was her first experience, I would say, with God, because she saw what it was doing to us and the family. And she decided to cut things off with that man and ask my dad for forgiveness. And this is a big part, too, because my dad did take her back and he forgave her. They've been married for like 30-plus years now, but he took her back, but my dad had a lot of resentment. Yeah. So now there's a lot of friction again in the house. There's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of me being in between, like my mom saying, do you hear what he's saying to me? And then my dad saying, do you see how your mom is? And I'm just sitting there like a little girl, like, what? What am I supposed to do, right? And then I felt like I couldn't side with one or the other. My mom had another, she would love to shop. So she would splurge, again, impulsively on all these things. And then before we would come in, she would tell me, if your dad asks, only say we spent like $100. But she like racked up.
Don't look at me, Alyssa.
That's literally my mom. I'm sorry, I just told this story last week. That's my mom.
Yeah.
Sorry, and it wasn't very often.
But that was so confusing to me, right? At that age, I'm like, so that was teaching me, okay, I can't be honest. I need to lie. And there was a lot of arguments over finances in our home because my mom would do all these impulsive things and then my dad would clean it up for her because he worked hard and he had money. And so again, when all this stuff was going on, I just felt out of place and I just felt self-conscious. I felt like I didn't belong. And then I started to get really angry towards my mom. Like, I felt like, how dare she do that to my dad? I just kind of had, again, through my own work, I realized that there was, like, resentment towards her because I would treat her a certain way sometimes, and I would think to myself, why do I treat her like that? But I was just angry. So then fast forward to when I'm a teenager, 15. So at that point, my dad, he wasn't drinking because he had been sober for about 18 years. And then it was a New Year's Eve, and he picked up his first drink again. So it was a glass of wine that was offered to him. And from there, that just like, it went full force. His alcoholism came back. And so now my dad's drunk, and my dad, not healing from what my mom did to him, would lash out on my mom verbally. My dad never physically hit my mom, but he was very verbally abusive. And my mom, on the other hand, was verbally, and there was times where I'm like, my mom's about to hit my dad because she would get so aggressive with him. And so there's all that. And at the time, I loved school. I've always been into school, so I always was in honors and AP classes, and I was in the gay program. I did all these things because I just loved school. But at 15, I started kind of, I don't know if it was a rebellion stage, but I just started hanging out with a different crowd. I didn't want to be home as much, so I started hanging out with the little skater crew, and, they're all about marijuana back then. I didn't know, there's, like, other stuff, too. I think I was a little naive to that. However, drinking was allowed in my household because my mom dropped the ball on that one too. She would say, well, I'd rather have you do that here than out there. So I was already allowed to drink. But I want to share this because it was my first experience with marijuana. So I'm hanging out with the skaters at the skate park in Fontana. And back then it wasn't like it is now where it's all gated up. You have to wear helmets. Like anybody could just go and chill, do whatever. And they were smoking marijuana, and they're like, oh, have you tried this before? And I'm like, no. And I'm like wanting to be cool girl because I want to fit in. And I'm like, yeah, I'll try it. And so I got so high, but I just remember like thinking like, I like this.
Yeah.
Like I like how I felt. And my dad, being the dad he was, who always wanted to enforce rules, he was looking for me. Someone had told me, oh, she had went to the skate park after school with some guys or whatever. So he picked me up at the skate park. Embarrassing. But he's like, get in the car. And he's like yelling at me. And I'm like, so this is how high I was. I was trying to put up the volume to the music, but I was turning the AC dial. Yes. And my dad's like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I tried to cover it up. I was lying and everything. I get home. My mom's super naive. She's like, I know she's high. She was probably smoking with them and drinking. My mom's like, no, she doesn't do that stuff. And I ate like so much food that day. And then I just knocked out. But after that, that's when I was like, I like that stuff. So one of the young boys that I was hanging out with ended up becoming my boyfriend. So I already had a boyfriend at 16 now at this point. And that's where, in his household, it was pretty much like mine. However, drugs and alcohol were not like something that we weren't allowed to do. So if we were smoking or drinking, like it wasn't, we were able to get away with it. So at 16 was when he's my boyfriend at the time. And this is a big part of like my addiction too, because I say like he was part of my addiction. He was an addiction for me for 10 years of my life because we were very abusive towards one another. It was a toxic relationship. I should have never been in that. However, I didn't have people around me to give me that guidance to pull me out.
Yeah.
And so because I didn't want to be in the home, I consumed myself in this relationship, and this young boy who was just as broken as I was, or even worse, was telling me who I was and gave me my identity. And I threw my whole self into him. And so I knew nothing but that. And so there at 16, he gave me my first hit of meth. And I'll never forget it. We were in his room, and he was like, you want to try it? And I'm like, sure. To me, I'm like, I want to try something new. I've done, weed. Alcohol was my thing still. I'm still drinking. And I took my first hit, and that, like, spiraled my life so crazy. So that drug is like, I know people say it all the time, but it's literally the devil's drug. Like it just brought out such an ugly side of me, but I know now it was a lot of my hurt and pain. And so we were abusive towards each other at a young age. And there was so much dysfunction that in my home that my parents didn't really pay attention. Like I'm staying at his house for like 2 weeks, and they're not even coming to see like where I'm at. And then there was times where my friends were trying to get a hold of me because I had a good, solid group of friends, which I'm still friends with today. But they were like the goody girls. Like they only would party here and there, but they were like scared to know that I was doing other stuff. Like, why are you doing all that? And what, you need to break up with him because they knew how abusive he was. And even their moms were like, honey, we're scared for you because this guy could kill you. Like the stuff that we were doing, we were that abusive towards each other. And so, that led to, within that time, we were what's considered club rats. So we were going to clubs, getting into clubs at a young age. And so there's cocaine there, there's pills there. And like I said, alcohol was always there. So I would drink pretty much whenever I was able to in high school. And then my grades started slacking. I was part of like drill and dance team. I didn't even finish through in my junior year and senior year. I did graduate, however, and I did want to go to college, but that is so hard to do when you're already like, and at the time I didn't know that I was addicted because I could not go a day without something.
Yeah.
So for me, I would justify, well, today I'm just going to have a couple drinks, or today I'm just going to have a couple lines, or today I'm just going to take a couple hits of the meth pipe, whatever. And I wanted to go to FINAM, which is a school in Los Angeles, and I was 18 at the time. And I went to the orientation, everything. I was so excited. Again, here's that abusive boyfriend, and I'm excited. I come back, and he was like, "You're not going anywhere." And I'll never forget this because he ripped up all of my orientation paperwork. He's like, "You're not going there." And I listened. So I was that broken that I was like, okay, I'm not going to go. Why? Because he wasn't doing anything. And he's already drug dealing at this point. So everything is like just so chaotic. I can't even think of a word. It was just so destructive and wild that I'm like, how, like, where were my parents at? You know, like, how did this happen? But again, they were in their own dysfunction. And so with all of that, I'm spiraling. I'm really a full flow, like just addiction, because I was literally doing something every day. And I just remember wanting to do better at the time. I just couldn't, because then I signed up at Chaffey College. So I'm like, okay, then I'll just go to community college. I'll take a class. And that didn't even last like a month because I couldn't even show up to class. Like that was like because I'm so either hungover or I'm trying to recover from the night before that I was like, there's no way I can't do this. I even tried to do the whole beauty school thing, and that was even crazier because there were so many girls at the time there that were using meth and cocaine. And so I found that crowd really quick. Right. So when we're addicts, we can find who we need to find when we need to. So I was going on my breaks with these girls, and we're getting drugs, and my mom and dad are over here paying for beauty school thinking that I'm attending, and I'm not. I'm like doing all this crazy stuff. And so within all of that, I was back and forth with that abusive ex, but with the addiction, there was a lot of manipulation that I did, and I would hook up with guys and use guys for whatever I needed. And so I'm going to fast forward to 2010. So at this time, I am, 20? I want to say it was like 23. I don't remember. It was all a blur, but it leads up to where I was at. But I moved to West Hollywood with one of my gay best friends. And I would say that was like the bottom of my bottom. Like I have never seen like just the worst of the worst. So my days were so dark. If you ladies are familiar with West Hollywood,
I was about to say, I was homeless out there for a while, and that was a nightmare.
Yes. So, drugs are like available at any corner, really.
Yes.
Literally. The gas station owner, because he was this Middle Eastern guy, and people always think I'm Middle Eastern. I'm not. I'm Mexican, okay? So he was like in love with me. So I'm like, cha-ching, I got me somebody here close by if I need anything. Like, and this guy would like, and I didn't go on a date with him, okay? He was like, whatever you need, baby, that's how they talk. Whatever you need, baby, you just come and tell me. I'm like, okay. And I will drag every guy that I could like that because I knew I could. And so he had stuff available right there. So I would just say, hey, I would come to his little like clerk area and I'd say, what do you have today? And he'd be like, well, I have this and that. Okay, I'm gonna come back later. And so we had whatever we needed. If not him, I had my gay best friend and we knew people and it was easy to get. So again, here I am. At this point I'm drinking bottles of alcohol a day. So that was a must. Okay, every day I would wake up, I had to have a drink because I had the shakes already. I had people in my life who would notice these things and would tell me stuff like, hey, when are you going to get yourself together? Like, look at you. And those were the people that I would cut out completely because I didn't want to hear it.
Right.
They were like tampering with my high or my buzz. I'm like, no, I'm cutting you out. And so again, I would just hang out with those people that were doing what I was doing. At the time, I worked 2 retail jobs. So I worked at Santa Monica Promenade, and I worked at the Beverly Center at Victoria's Secret. And so out there, that whole lifestyle is very fast, and there's a lot of men who have money, and they want to like pretty much buy you. And one thing that I do remember is for me, I see that there was a few times where I could have been trafficked, but I can look back now and I know that it was God's hand that was protecting me because for whatever reason in those moments, like, and I'm not gonna lie, there were times where I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I had friends that had daddies and all this stuff. They would make all this money, but it always stuck with me. Like, wait a minute, you're no different from the lady that's walking the streets. If you're gonna do that, you're no different. And that was something that stuck with me because I would try to justify these behaviors. Now, not to say that I didn't use other men for things because I knew I could do it or manipulate it, but that was just me and my personality. I was very self-centered, didn't care really about anybody or anything. And I had a lot of the nights there where I thought to myself, tonight's going to be the night I'm going to die. And that was just my thinking, and I was okay with it. And then the days that I would wake up, I just felt like crap. Like, I literally felt like I was dying every day, but I had to keep going and using because of that feeling of withdrawal. I didn't know it was withdrawals. I just thought, like, okay, I just need it. And so there was a lot of clubbing, partying. It just got really bad. I was, like, bringing guys home that I didn't even know who they were, and just, like, getting in situations where, you know, I should have been dead. At one point, this one guy, like, pulled a knife on me. It was just wild. He started stalking me. Cops came, broke our door down at one point in the apartment, and it just was getting just so crazy and chaotic. And so I knew I always had this feeling inside of me, and it's one of those things where I always felt like, is this it? Like, is this my life? There has to be something more. Like, there has to be, like, this life that I'm living. Like, literally, that was my whole day. Getting up, getting a drink, getting the next hit, finding who we could find just so that we can get what we needed. And work, like, there was days that I wouldn't even show up to work, and my coworkers are, like, blowing up my phone, like, where the hell are you? They're asking for you. You better come now. And I'm going in 3 days later acting like nothing happened, and they're, like, pulling me aside, like, what's going on with you? You haven't been here for 3 days, and you're just showing up?
You cannot play that off.
And, you know, and it's, like, I can laugh at it now, but when I think about them, I'm thinking, like, they probably, like, what is wrong with this chick, you know? Like, what's wrong with her?
Right.
And there was actually a supervisor that I had because I work at the Santa Monica Promenade at Levi's. And she was this really cool, down-to-earth girl. And I'll always remember these, like, certain moments. And to me, I look back, and it's like God was using them. I didn't see it at the time, but he would use them to tell me things. So she pulled me aside one time. She was like, Lizzie, you know, she goes, you have a lot of great qualities about you. She's like, and I don't know what you're doing or what you're into right now. She's like, but what do you want to do with yourself? And I'm like, what do you mean? You know, like, what? She's like, what do you want to do? Like, is there something that you want to do? She's like, because you're capable of a lot. And to me, at the time, I didn't understand it, but I know she knew that there was something up with my life. Like, something's up with this chick, you know, like, she needs help. I didn't see it or know it at the time, but I remember there's glimpses. I feel like God shows me, like, that was me. That was me. I had friends who were believers and would randomly, like, message me, I'm praying for you. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, freaking weirdos. Like, I used to think like that. Like, who, like, they don't know me, right? But they were seeing my life. I even had aunts. I know my mom was constantly praying for me. And so once all that happened, so the last thing that for me was, like, the cherry on top at West Hollywood was when this person was stalking me. And then cops came into our place because there was a lot of stuff going on in there. And of course, everything was, I don't know nothing about it. That was my whole thing. I don't know. I don't even know what was going on. I had no idea, that, you know, that whole lying thing. And at this point, I am now drinking and using Xanax. So if you're familiar with Xanax and alcohol, you are a walking zombie. So that's kind of like how my whole end of West Hollywood was, where I'm waking up to my phone and text messages and missed phone calls of, like, everything that I had done, and I had no memory of it whatsoever. And that was scary for me because I'm literally walking out in the streets, talking to people. I don't even know if I was in situations that I shouldn't have been. I don't even remember. And then waking up feeling like, oh my gosh, did I get hit by a car? Literally, because my body would be so sore. Sometimes I would have random bruises, and I'm like, did I fight someone? Like, I don't know. Like, these are things that I don't remember. And there's one thing that I want to share, because I fast forward to like when I get sober, but I remember when I finally felt like I can't do this anymore. Like, I need to leave here, because I'm thinking West Hollywood's the problem, but it was me the whole time, and the drugs and alcohol. But I'm like, I need to get out of this city. Like, I can't do it anymore. And I remember going to my car, because in West Hollywood, they have these underground, LA, those underground garages. And so it's gated. Nobody can get in unless you have a key or whatnot. But I remember I was going to my car, and there was a keychain on the floor, and it had these little praying hands, and you flip it over, and on the other side, it had the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change. And, the whole prayer on it, right? And I'm like, what the heck? And I'm looking around, because I'm like, who left this? But I kept it. I'm like, okay, whatever. I'll put on my keychain. But I can look back, and I'm like, these were my little hints, right, along the way. And so once I come back home, I come back and I move in with my parents, and I'm like in this like depressive state. Like, I'm not looking for work. I'm drinking even more. I'm still doing pills. My justification with the messing is like, well, at least I'm not smoking it, but I was like snorting it here and there and doing cocaine. So all that justifying, making excuses for myself. And then that leads me to June 6th, 2012. So that day, for some reason, I just thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to try not to drink today. Like, I'm just not going to try for at least like an hour. That was my thinking. Because I literally would open my eyes to go to either the corner to get like a little shooter or like a shot, just to get rid of like the shakiness, or call a friend to find out how I was going to get money so I can get that bottle, or see if anybody had what I needed. And so I don't even know if it was an hour. Again, the time lapse was kind of off because of like what happened, but I ended up being on the bathroom floor, my parents' floor, and ended up having a seizure. And it was from the withdrawals. I didn't know that at the time, but because I didn't use, my body was so used to, my brain, everything was so used to having substances in it that it couldn't even last like an hour or so without it. And so that for me was the first time that I genuinely called out to God, and I asked for his help. I needed help. Like, I down and out, bathroom floor, no one's there with me. At the time I was like 90 pounds. Okay. I'm like 130 pounds now, but I was like 90 pounds. I was like this walking skeleton. And for the first time, I just felt this peace that came over me, and it didn't make sense then, again, but it makes sense now. But I just remember hearing this voice, like this audible voice, and I felt this peace. And it was so loud. It says, you need to tell your parents that you need help. You will turn your life around, and you'll let others know that it's possible. And I just felt, I just like, it was like this awe, like, oh my gosh. And I had never experienced anything like that before, but I knew it was God. And before that, I would look to God whenever I needed to get out of something, and then once I was out of him, like, peace out, like, God who? And I didn't know God like that, so I did that, and I told my parents, I told my mom, I was like, I need help. I'm sick. I don't know what's wrong with me. They take me to the hospital. Again, God was using the doctor there. The doctor's like, I need to know everything that you've been doing, and he's like, I need every single drug that you've been using. I need to know what you're doing, when you last used. And I'm like giving him this list of things. Then my mom's crying her eyes out, because for the first time I'm admitting it in front of her. And she's like, I knew something was wrong. I knew something. And I'm like so self-centered. And I'm like, get this bee out of this room. Do you see what I have to deal with at home? And the doctor's like looking at me like, she brought you to the hospital. Like, what? And so I'm like, get her out. And so they're like, we're going to have to take you out. And so they took my mom out of the room. And he was like, you need help. And I'm like, for what? He was like, do you not see this list of things that you've been using? He's like, you need to get yourself help. And I honestly, I know it sounds silly, but I didn't know what he was talking about. I'm like, help for what? And he's like, you have a drug problem. And he's like, you're not healthy. You're 25 now. You will not live to see 30 if you keep doing what you're doing. And I was like, okay, you know, and I kind of, it didn't make sense to me because one, I'm like coming down from all this stuff, and two, I'm like, but like help. I'm thinking, because I didn't think I had a problem. And so he's like, you need to go somewhere. And I'm like, but where? And he's like, you need to go to a rehab. And again, I know it sounds silly because of what I do today, but I'm like, what's a rehab? You know, it's like, I wasn't, people would call me Lindsay Lohan back in the day when she was like a hot mess and stuff. No. And they would call me like Snooki because, you know, she was always partying and drinking. But I never knew that there was like these places that they could go to, right? And you would hear stories about them in the newspaper, like, on articles, like, they went into rehab, they came out. But I'd never put two and two together, like what they were doing.
Right.
Because I was so consumed in all that. But he suggested that I did that, and that stuck with me. So the whole ride home, and I'm still in denial. I'm like, well, if the doctor is telling me that I have a problem, maybe I have a problem. Maybe I should ask for help. And it was 2 weeks of just agony because I was going through withdrawals. They gave me medications and stuff to help me while I was at home. But I was so angry. I was so angry because deep down inside, I knew I didn't want to go back to the drugs and alcohol anymore. But physically, like, I felt like I was going to die. Like, I just was like, I'm going to die like this, because it was so painful. But I knew I didn't want to go back to it because I didn't want to get in that dark place that I felt when I was using and drinking. And so I ended up telling my mom, okay, I'm open to going. I'll go to a rehab. And so my family's like scrambling to find me a place because I finally said, okay. And I don't know what that feels like, but I just remember my mom being so like just all over the place and calling people, you need to help me get her somewhere. And she said yes. And she's like frantic. And my sister-in-law was the one that finally found a place. But here I am. I'm looking at the Orange County rehabs, like the ones that are doing yoga, going to Starbucks. I'm like, that's where I'm trying to go because that's who I was. I'm like, I am not going to, like, I need to know where I'm going.
Malibu
and then,
recovery.
yeah. And I'm like, there's men that sponsor like girls, but you know what that's about. And then like, I'm like messaging people, hey, I heard, I'm looking for a sponsor to get into like rehab and this and that. This one guy writes back to me and he's like, well, I can get you in there in about a month. And I'm like, okay, that's cool, but not thinking how crucial it was. Like when you're in that moment, it's so important to get that person in that moment because they're ready in that moment. And my mom's like, okay, we found a place. There's a place for you in San Bernardino, and they can get you in tonight by 6 p.m., so you have to have all your stuff ready. And I'm like, well, what's the name of it? And she's like, it's called Gibson House. So I go online, and I'm trying to find it.
Been there.
And at the time, they didn't even have a website. So this is my self-centeredness. I'm like, how dare you guys try to send me to some place in San Bernardino with no website? What are you guys thinking? Like, how dare you? And that's my, bratty self because why? We always got our way. And my mom, she had her moments, but this was one of those moments where I'm like, I'll never forget. She's like, pack your stuff. She goes, and be ready by that time because you're going. And I'm like, okay. So I said, and I'm like, well, if I have my stuff ready, already there I am. If I have my stuff ready, then yeah, maybe I'll go. But I packed my bag. And at the time, I was still talking to that abusive ex. Mind you, he's drug dealing. Okay. He's like using all kinds of substances that you could think of. And she calls him and is like, Mijo, can you come, pick us up because we're going to take her and drop her off. And I'm messaging all my friends, hey, I'll be back out and I'll see you soon, because I was already planning, like, once I get out, I'm going to just go back to the old crowd and hang out with them. So I was like, I'll see you guys probably, like, in a month or so, whatever. And so I'm, like, messaging everyone. And then I get to this place in San Bernardino, Gibson House off of D Street, and I walk in there and they're asking me all these questions. I do my assessment. My mom at this point is trying to get my ex-boyfriend to go across the street because that's where they had them in. And she's like, I know you guys have had your struggles. Like, why don't you go to the, across the street? And he's like, I don't need this. Like, he's like, she's the one that needs it. And so I ended up staying and doing the program. However, here's self-centered bratty Lizzie. I walk in and I see bunk beds in a room and I'm like, what is this? And they're like, this is where you're staying. And I'm like, I don't share a room with anybody, and I don't sleep on a bunk bed. And they're like, this is your room, and you're going to put your stuff right here. And I'm like, and here I am with bags of clothes. I had a rack of clothes, and some of the women that were coming in there literally were coming with the clothes off their back, straight from prison, from the streets. And I'm just like looking around, and I'm like, I'm not like them. I'm not like them. They have a problem. Like, they have legal issues. They don't have their kids. And I'm 25, mind you. And so the first 2 weeks, I like cried my eyes out in bed because I was feeling everything for the first time. Like, I was actually feeling my feelings and everything that I've done and all the destructiveness. And I couldn't believe where I was at. And I can't believe that I'm in a rehab in San Bernardino in a bunk bed for me. But it's like, it was hitting me, you know? And then I swore up and down every day that I was leaving. I was that girl. I don't need to be here. You guys are the ones that be here. And they'd be like, then leave. The effing door's right there. Like, they would talk to me like that. And I'm like, but I knew I needed it. So, like, that part of me would stay. And then I would listen. And I started doing what they suggested me to do, like the homework. And the women there, I know now God placed them there at the perfect time because they were older. A lot of these women were older. And the way that they would talk to me, nobody had ever talked to me like that before. So my mom, here comes my mom. Here she is spoiling me. I asked her for a pack of cigarettes. She brings me a big old duffel bag with clothes and all these things. And I'm yelling at her. I didn't effing tell you to bring me all this. I just asked for a effing pack of cigarettes. She was like, well, I just wanted to bring you some stuff. And I'm like, I didn't ask you for all this. And I'm like, this is how I would talk to my mom, okay? And as soon as she would leave, those women would come to me and they're like, you self-centered little, and they would call me that, you know, the word, the B word. And they're like, how dare you talk to your mom like that when she's coming out of her way to bring you stuff after everything I'm sure you've done to her too. And they're like, we don't even have family to bring us stuff. And so the more that they would tell me these things, I was actually like, you know, paying attention and listening. And when they would share their stories, I'm like, I am them. That will be me one day if I don't get it. And there was a older, she was a Native woman. She wasn't that old. She was like in her 50s, but she had aged so much. The alcohol aged her. And I remember her telling me, like, you need to get it right now. You're so young. She's like, do you want to end up like me? And at the time, this is my thinking. I'm like, is this a trick question? Because I'm like, hell no. Like, I don't want to be like you. And that's how I was. And then she's like, because if you don't stop and you go back out, she's like, you will be me one day. And those were those moments where I'm like, this stuff is real. Like, because I remember being 15 and here I am 25 and I don't even remember like half of it.
It passed
and
by
the years
fast.
just flew by. And here I have this woman who's like in her 50s, looks way older though, and she's trying to get her life together. And I'm like, and so because I was so young, a lot of them would pour into me like that. And I'm thankful for that. And little by little, God was humbling me because all the stuff that I brought, like my makeup and my clothes, and I would say, here, do you want this? And they're like, are you sure? And I'm like, because at the time I'm not like exaggerating, I took like 24 pairs of like Levi's because I had worked at Levi's and I had all this clothes and makeup. And I'm like, no, you can have it. Like, I'm good. I have this. And so I just started noticing that, hey, not everybody had what you had. Okay. And not everybody had it as bad as, you know, you did. I mean, people had it worse, you know, like some of the stories that these women were sharing, I'm like, it was similar, but if I didn't stop, it could get to that place, you know? And I went to my first NA meeting there. And again, I bawled my eyes out because I'm like, I'm not the only crazy person. Like, these people are doing the same thing I was, but even worse, you know? And I felt like, okay, people get it. They understand. And at the time I got a sponsor. Her wife worked at an insurance company, and so I wanted to go to work. And so I actually moved into the sober living that they offered at Gibson House because once the time came that I was going to finish up, I swore up and down I was going to go back home. But I knew that I couldn't. Like, I needed more of that. I needed more support. I needed that accountability, people being real with me like that. And So I moved into the sober living. And even then I had really bad habits. So like they always knew that I like to get myself ready. So I played it out where I knew when the house manager was leaving. So I knew that I can hang out a little more at the house. And then I would tell them that I would go job search, but I was just walking around San Bernardino doing whatever I wanted. But again, I knew that I had to do something different. And so she got me a job. I was working at an insurance company. So that was really helpful. And the girls at the sober living, they would go to church every Sunday. And they would invite me all the time, but I just was like, oh no, I go to the Rock, which is another church in San Bernardino. And they're like, but you don't go anywhere on Sundays. And I'm like, cute. So here I am trying to lie my way out again. And they're like, just come. You're just home anyway. And so I went, and it was the Way World Outreach here in San Bernardino. And the moment I walked in, I was like, oh my gosh, I felt like I was at home. And I dedicated my life to the Lord, and I started looking around at the women that were there and the way they carried themselves and how they spoke and the way they dressed. Because I was like this little hoochie still. Like my shirts were low and my boobies were out, and I had my little short shorts, and I was still smoking cigarettes and cussing every other word. And I'm just like, gosh, look at how graceful they are. Like they're just so peaceful, and they're beautiful, and they're covered up. And so I would look at that, and I got plugged in with the classes that they had there. The Bible studies that they had for women. I didn't know anybody there, so I kind of was like hesitant, but I started doing the classes in the Bible studies. And I started receiving a lot of healing and deliverance from those classes. And there was a lot of deep-rooted stuff that I had to start to let go and forgive. And so I started going that route for my recovery, which I still like have people on Facebook from like the 12-step community that I was involved with. They're all still doing great, which is amazing.
Wow.
I invited some of them to my wedding, but with the whole spiritual side, I just found for me in my recovery, I was growing a lot faster. And I was like digging in deep to those deep-rooted stuff and finding out why I was so resentful towards my mom, and remembering what happened when I was 10 and forgiving her, and then forgiving that ex who was abusive towards me, because there was a lot of pain and hurt there, but I had to let him go. Because when I was in the sober living, it just got wild with him, because he would drop me off right before I was supposed to be home at curfew, just so I could get kicked out. At one point, he had planted one of his like drug scales in my bag and hoping that they would find it. And it was just a lot of that. And in my brokenness, I would, cry and say, I love him. And they're like, the girls in the house are like, what are you doing? Like, he obviously doesn't care about you. Look at what he's doing. And at the time, I felt like I was clean from everything, drugs and alcohol and all that, but I was still living dirty is what I felt like. And I'm like, I can't do this. It was like a double life.
Yeah.
And so that was another surrender. I'm like, God, if he's not for me, like rip him from my life. And God did that. Like I wanted to have like you see the movies, like a formal breakup, like I'm done with you. Like, we're not going to do this anymore. Like he could care less. Like once I told him, I was like, you need to come because I need to talk to you about some stuff. And I made that declaration to God, like, help me. If he's not for me, remove him. Like, he didn't even call me. He didn't text me. Like, it was like that. He made it easy like that for me. And that's not to say that my codependency didn't play a part in church, because I found a boyfriend right away, and which I should have never been in. And that, long story short, we ended up breaking up. But once I let that go, I was like, okay, God, I'm tired of doing things my way. I'm tired. Okay. Because at this point, I think I was like at 2 years, but my first 2 years of recovery were like a roller coaster, if I could explain. And so I said, God, it's me and you. I did that inner work with God. I put God number one. I'm like, it's me and you, Jesus. For me, I'm like, I just need to focus on what I'm doing. I need to grow. I need to heal. I went back to school because I've always loved school. That was always in me. And so then I became a drug and alcohol counselor. I got certified. And through that is where I started at MFI. So I became an intern at MFI. And then I got hired on with MFI. So I was with MFI for 6 years. And throughout this whole journey, I've had support system. I have a mentor. I've been going to Bible studies. I've had these women of God, real genuine women of God who have been there for me, have prayed for me. if I was struggling or going through anything, I could be honest and open with them, and they would help me through it. And so, being at MFI, I learned so much working there. For me as a counselor, like just the structure of everything, curriculum, and just learning how to teach. Because at first, when I first started, I had like my first little group of 6 clients, and I remember telling my supervisor at the time, I'm like, I can't go in there, I can't run that group. She's like, you're gonna be fine. Just go in there. You're great at what you do. Just be confident in yourself. And I was so terrified, but I worked with outpatient first, and then with my second part of my internship, I had to go to residential, and it was the men's facility. At that time, they housed, I think it was 65 men.
Oh, no.
And my director there was like, hey, have you run groups before? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, great, you're going to run your first group here. And it was like a room full of like 60 men. And I'm like, oh my gosh, but God was stretching me. He was stretching me. And it was, it was just a great journey because I learned so much. And so now I work for Time for Change Foundation, and I've been there for 8 months now. And we're a shelter program for women and women with children. And it's been such a blessing working for this foundation. It's a nonprofit because from the minute these women are coming in, you are seeing how much of a wraparound program this is. So they get, all new clothes, because we say they dress for success. So it's professional clothes, so that they can look nice. They get, we have a workforce development director, so they help them with their resume, start applying for work. I'm the drug and alcohol counselor, so I do the outpatient program for Time for Change. So I facilitate all of the classes in the evening for the ladies for outpatient. Awesome. And so seeing these women coming in, and they have to be clean, right? And so we do random drug testing. They're getting back on their feet. They create a savings. They're learning. They do parenting and therapy and leadership and advocacy, and they teach them all these things there. You just see the miracle of when someone is doing the work, right? You do your own work. Right. And everybody does learn different, but as a counselor, it's just such a blessing to see. And now for myself, because Monday, right, will be my 10 years in my own recovery. Yes, I see now what other people were seeing in me when I first came in. So when they would tell me stuff like, when I got that boyfriend right away, they're like, you shouldn't be in that relationship. And I'm like, well, thinking in my head, like, I'm going to do what I want to do. And sure enough, I shouldn't have been in it. Right. But there was a lot of things I did that I call them the fine line moments in my early recovery, because I would get myself in situations, but I would make a different choice because I would remember, okay, remember when you did do that back in the day, let's do this, and I would think it through, okay? So I was using skills, not even knowing, but at the time, I made a different choice. Okay, I'm not going to, I did that before, but you know what, I'm going to do it this way this time, and then it led me somewhere different, a better outcome. And the more that I did that little by little, and I started listening to the people around me, taking those suggestions, using my own skills, I always say I have the practical side and I have the spiritual side. So for me, I sit here today and people meet me and they're like, I can never picture you being like that. And I'm like, that is so humbling to me, because it's like, oh my gosh, if you guys would have met the Lizzie 10 years ago, you'd be like, that girl is a freaking mess. Like, she is a hot mess. Like, and it's just such a beautiful thing. It's such a beautiful thing when people can really surrender and be open and willing to try something different and make these different choices by utilizing your support. I'm huge on that, having support. You will see changes. You will see different outcomes in your life. And even for me as a counselor working at Time for Change, it's just such, I'm seeing that every week. There's something new that comes up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, God, you are so good. When He opens doors for some of these women, they're getting their kids back. They're getting reunified. They're creating that savings and getting their own apartment. And within that, with Time for Change, they do furnish their apartment for the women, so they don't have to worry about any of that. They do help them with, getting into their apartment as well. And there's other programs too. So we have what's called the RAP program, so rental assistance program. So these are for formerly incarcerated men or women who have been to California State Prison. So as long as they could provide a CDCR number and some other documents, they can help with first month's rent. Or if they're living with a family member, they can help with a family stipend. So they'll cover 30% of whatever that person, whoever they're living with, their rent or mortgage to help, so it doesn't seem like a burden on the person.
It's amazing.
And then they have another program, a LEAD program, so it helps them with like finding employment, helping them get the clothing that they need to be successful at that job. So there's a lot of support there, and everyone's heart is in it that works there. So it's just a beautiful thing to see. And so I just feel so blessed because I get to do this stuff. For me, it's not a job. It's a purpose now.
Right.
And when I think of what was said to me by God in 2012, I look at where I'm at today, and I'm like just in awe because it's 10 years later, and I am in that purpose, and I can now show and teach people that it is possible to change. But we have to do the work. And for me, I always say it's by the grace of God that I'm here today. For me, I'm like, I look back at all these moments in my life where things could have gone a lot worse for me. But I know now that God's hand was over me. He was protecting me. But I had to make that choice to say, okay, I surrender all of that and I'm open to the new. What do I need to do? And I started to apply it. And that's so huge. I tell my clients all the time, like, you can have all this head knowledge and know all these things, but if you're not applying it, you're not going to see anything change. And it's not always easy. It's very hard sometimes, but it's a must. It's a must. And it's a guarantee you're going to see change. You will.
Okay.
It's not to say that everything's perfect and easy because there's struggles. And I've had a lot of struggles in between all of this, and there's things that I've gone through. However, I see and I'm humbled in awe of what God has done in my life because I'm married now, which I never swore up and down that I would never commit to one man. I used to say that back in the day. But these are the things
have
that...
1 minute, sorry.
1 minute, Lizzie.
Oh, okay.
Can we ask you to come back in July?
What happened?
Are we able to ask you to come back and maybe in July?
Yeah, of course. I would love to.
Yeah, because we want to hear about your husband, about what you're doing with The Way, because I know you're working with children now.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
And who did you want to dedicate this show to?
I want to dedicate this to my Uncle George, who passed away about over 10 years ago, and he was a former addict, and so I love and miss him, but I want to dedicate it to George Santos.
Awesome.
Thank
Dedicated
you
to
so
George
much.
Santos. Thank you so much, Lizzie. We'll talk to you again in July. We so
All right,
appreciate you.
awesome.
Great
Take
job,
care.
girl.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you for listening to
Bye-bye.
Dying to Get Well on KCAA Radio, 102.3 FM, 1050 AM, and 106.5 FM.
Station that leaves no listeners.
Diversified radio station on the dial, KCAA.